All right, fellows. Let me turn off this fan real quick. This is going to be a quick video just over the Tyranid Precon because I haven't really tried to upgrade it since I bought those videos, and so I decided maybe I would try and do a slight upgrade to it uh, and try to keep some flavorful cards. So I tried to keep everything as flavorful as I could. We did add in a few more artifacts. Although this deck hasn't been play tested, I'll kind of explain kind of what I'm thinking. In addition, we're going to go over what are potential cuts and also some more cards that we're going to be going in. So just from the pre-con standard, potential cuts, and we do have one card that we added in that we're potentially going to cut as well, but I'm not sure yet. So all of the enchantment, sorcery, ramps and stuff, we basically took it out. You have like 54, 55 or something when the pre-con. We're swapping Swarmlord out for Lucia Kane to be the commander, since that lowers the mana value, and also she is a mana dork, gives us 2 mana. We're lowering everything down to about 49 mana. And the idea is essentially we're going to try and make the deck run a little bit like the Dark Lord from Lord of the Rings precon that we have, because we upgraded that deck. Essentially, it starts a little slow, but once you get your commander on board and it's online, it literally just swarms the board so quick and goes through cards. So that's what our plan is here. So we cut Rampant Growth, Harrow, Explore, um, First Tyrannic War we took out, Gargoyle Flock we're taking out because it's just a little slow. Tyranid Invasion we're taking out, Lictor we took out, Gearson Starn, Kellamorph we're taking out. The Red Terror we took out. You could potentially add the Red Terror back in. The difference though is that I think it's very niche on what you can use it for. Essentially, it says whenever a red source you control deals damage to one or more permanents and or players, put a 1/1 counter on the Red Terror. The only way I can really think to use this effectively in this deck is with board wipes like Blast, Misact, and things. But you can use that because there is Starstorm in the deck, and you have the Exocrine along with a few other red type cards that would give it 1/1 counters. But really, the fastest that you're going to get it big is to have it on the board and then hit like a Blast Misact or something, hit everything for like 13 damage. Make sure that there's like 20 creatures on board and then make it grow really bad, like really quick. So we cut that. The Goliath truck we took out, it's just kind of iffy. Shadow in the Warp we took out, not really the best for here. Herald's Horn and Icon of Ancestry we took out. The card draw just wasn't fast enough for what we're trying to do. Genestealer Locust we took out. Acolyte Hybrid we took out. And the Farseek we took out as well. Now, when we go over to look at the other cards that are on the chopping block right now, but we're going to try and keep most of these in. We have Cultivate, which is the other sorcery spell for ramp. Potentially is going to be gone. Rite of Passage is a card that we added into the deck. It is a 2 and a green. Whenever a creature you control is dealt damage, put a 1/1 counter on it. When I first put this in, my base idea was that if you attacked into somebody and your creature was going to die, you could put a 1/1 counter on it and stay alive. But that's not really how it works, apparently. But essentially, what this would do is allow your creatures to swarm over an opponent's blockers, and then you get an additional 1/1 counter on your creature. Every time that you kill another creature, you're going to be growing your creature over and over, which is kind of thematic with a Tyranid, and the photo itself kind of looks more like a Tyranid as well. So ideally, that was kind of the situation, and I was going to cut it, but we decided to add some artifacts to the deck, so it's probably going to be a little bit better. Um, Namely, Stronic Resignator, Lithoform Engine, um, Primal Vigor, maybe Doubling Season would be additions. So the deck isn't exactly budget, but it isn't exactly super competitive. It's going to be like a pretty balanced, I would think, but the main weak point is going to be enchantments and artifacts, so you're essentially going to want to run over an opponent's creatures, but the deck isn't really built to deal with enchantments, artifacts, and all that kind of stuff. It's going to let you run over people's creatures though very quickly once it gets online. So rite of passage potentially could be on the chopping block, but I like the idea of all your creatures tack in, they block 4 of them. Those 4 creatures get an additional 1/1 counter. Primal Vigor or Doubling Seasons on the board, they get 2/1/1 counters. Um, you know, Shronic Resignator, copy, 4 or 5. So it can pop off pretty quick depending on how it is. Um, Death Leaper Terror Weapon is on the chopping block because although it does give creatures that enter the battlefield this turn double strike, I think that's very niche, and also the artwork isn't exactly as crazy as a lot of the Tyranid stuff. There's a lot of Tyranid artwork cards that I really had a hard time removing, like the sorcery spells. New Horizons is on the chopping block because that's an additional Aurora, things like that. We're not going to have the ability to recur these if they go into the graveyard, and we're only going to have a couple of graveyard recursions in the deck, probably only 2. So it's going to be very situational with those, so I kind of just cut them. And since we're not using Swarmlord as the main commander anymore, we don't necessarily need that very quick ramp up. As long as we can get that 4 mana, then we're instantly going to be popping the 2. We get that Soul Ring effect off of our commander, which is pretty strong. So potentially another card on the chopping block is the Bio Titan. I still want to keep this in just because my thinking is that the Bio Titan could be good for getting a board presence back after a board wipe or something along those lines. Essentially, I could give up 5 counters to get a 12/12 again, and then just keep swinging in with Vigilance. So it puts someone on their heels. It's going to give you. Essentially, we're using our creatures as extra removal, although we already have essentially 9 removals. Um, all the creatures in the deck are basically bigger removals. So if you wanted to make this deck more competitive, you'd probably just want to slot some of these type of cards in for more mana or artifact and enchantment hate. But I'm trying to keep on flavor with the Tyranids. So Bio Titan, I'm trying to try to keep it in, but it's potentially a chopping block. Exocrine is another one, so it's just a 2/4 Tyranid. Reach Death Touch. All lands have tap, add 1 mana of any color, and lose all other abilities. I don't necessarily think it's the craziest thing in the deck, but I'm not opposed to it just because it could potentially stop our opponents from using some crazy land effects on us, like exiling our graveyard or something. So I might keep that around. Tyranid Prime is on the chopping block just because other creatures you have it evolve. It's a low cost Tyranid. I like the artwork, reminds me a lot of like Alien versus Predator. But evolve is whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if that creature has greater power or toughness than this creature, put a 1/1 counter on this creature. So essentially, if you're dumping your mana into an X cost spell, and then that enters, it's going to give you 1/1 counters. And since Lucia Kane can copy those X spells coming in, then you could potentially get multiple triggers off of this. So it could stay in, could not. I don't really know. Last one is the Venom Throat is potentially on the chopping block. I do like this card. It is a 3-drop flying Death Touch Hexproof 2/2. I really like the artwork on the card, which is why I'm trying to keep it in, but also because if I put 1/1 counters on this, it has built-in protection, Death Touch, and Flying Evasion. So could be a pretty solid card to like dump your extra 1/1 counters onto. So kind of things to keep in mind when we're talking about these cards. As for additions to the deck, because we essentially are trying to keep most of the precon together, cards that I'm trying to get right now are uh, Biomancy Master, which essentially is a green-blue creature that whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it gets 1/1 counters equal to the Biomancy, the Master's power. So essentially, Lucia Kane could put 1/1 counters on him when he enters the battlefield every turn, and then when you have 1/1 counters on him, you're instantly going to be able to essentially copy over all of his power over to another creature, which is pretty strong in general. Okay, then we're going to have Twinning Staff, which is essentially going to be Lucia's King's weapon. So whenever you copy a spell, you can copy it again. So if I have the Twinning Staff and Lucia Kane on the field, and it's a 3-drop artifact, I believe, I can copy things twice, which will give me more Tyranids, which will help make up for the loss of Tyranids that we had from cuts in the deck. We still have like, you know, 28, 30 plus Tyranids or creatures, but we're gonna want um, to be able to copy those effects because each of those Tyranids are potential card draw, card advantage, because Lucia King can copy them. Otherwise, they just kind of replace themselves for like 6 mana, which isn't really the best. But we're trying to grind through the deck as quickly as possible and get our big beaters out and kind of beat people before they can set their stuff up. And we're going to be going a little bit slower since we cut a bit of mana out of there. But our card draw is going to get ridiculous if the deck gets rolling. So that's the plan. The next thing that we're going to be having is doubling season, just because it doubles 1/1 counters and also doubles tokens. So it'll double Lucina Kane, it'll double the 1/1 counters. All that stuff's going to be good. And then Finale of Devastation is going to be one of our graveyard recursions. So it's a X cost spell, and if it goes above 10, I believe, you can copy it. And then essentially you get to search out any creature that's in your deck or your library or your graveyard and put it on the battlefield. And if it's over 10, you get to put basically 10 power or what else you have on every creature that you have. And I think they get trample for the end turn, or something along those lines, or maybe it's just a power bonus. But that's a lot of power that can be on the board, especially if you're copying the spell effect, because Lucia Kane can already copy it once, so you can get 2 creatures back on the board and double the power on all your creatures for that turn. But if you have Stronic Resignator, or Lithoform Engine, or uh, the Twinning Staffs and stuff like that, you're going to be able to multiply those effects and just get bigger and bigger creatures for a turn. You wouldn't be surprised if you got like 40, 50 power, depending on how much mana that you dump into things. So that's all going to be that. Now, the additional cards that we added into the decks, essentially, I'm just going to tell you the ones that we added in because we already told you the cuts, and then I'll kind of cut this down a little bit. So we have Garruk's Uprising. Got this artwork, kind of looks like there's Tyranids in the background. Whenever Group's Uprising enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. So 3 mana to draw a card, not too bad. Creatures you control have trample, which is pretty good, and also it's an enchantment, so it kind of gets a little bit of protection. And whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So you get to draw a card, and also you get more potential card draw, as well as another source of trample, because in this deck we have like 2 or 3 sources of trample, just to go over the top of things, nothing too crazy. But it does help in games as well as give us a pretty nice form of card draw, especially when we're making copies of tokens. We could get multiple cards per turn on this if we really have it down on the ground. Primal Vigor. Um, it's a 5-drop enchantment. If one or more tokens would be put on the battlefield, twice that many of those tokens are put on the battlefield instead. If one or more 1/1 counters would be placed on a creature, twice that many 1/1 counters are placed on that creature instead. So this can basically go crazy with a lot of things. Just imagine like we've cast Lucia Kane a couple times. Swarmlord comes out, gets like 4 or 6 1/1 counters, and this thing's doubling them, and he's getting like 8, 12 1/1 counters just in that sense alone. And in this deck, basically, we have a few different ways to win, but we're gonna have basically 2 like immediate win cons, which is like the Swarm Lord and Simic Symmetry. So Simic Symmetry, if this comes down, essentially it's a 1-turn get rid of it, or I win the game card, and we can put 3 mana to put a 1/1 counter on creatures that we control. But you could cut this if you didn't want it in here because it's too powerful for your group or whatever. But that right there can just win the game outright in a turn, potentially turn 2, turn 3, depending on what you do. Because all you need is 21/1 counters on your creatures, and this is already going to be triggering and popping off. So turn 2, this could come down. Um, yeah, and you can get 1/1 counters pretty quickly. So kind of a big timer, but anytime this comes down, literally you can put this down and then put any X cost spell and then copy it with Lucia Kane. Then you get twice as many. So you put like a 5-drop X cost spell, you copy it, boom, boom, and then it gets copied by another thing. This goes up to 20. You win the game. So that's pretty good. Next one we got is Greater Good. This is one of the repeatable card draws that we're putting into the deck. Instead of using sorceries and things which I thought about doing, or things that let you draw cards based on how many creatures you have, because in the off chance that you don't have any creatures, that kind of sucks. But the Greater Good is a 4-drop enchantment. Sacrifice a creature, which gives you a way to kind of benefit from your creatures dying, or sack them for value before a board wipe or something and draw your whole deck. Or you could just use this to get rid of a creature that gets pacified or something that you can't use anymore, to get a little bit more value off of it. But you can draw a ton of cards off of this deck for sure, especially since you can sack any number of creatures with it. So you could like pay a 5-drop X cost spell for Lucia Kane, and then copy it 2 or 3 times, and then sack 2 of them, draw 10 cards in one turn. So this is going to be a pretty powerful draw spell. Lithoform Engine lets you copy a spell that you have, lets you copy an instant or sorcery spell you control, or you can copy an activated triggered ability. You can also copy target permanent spell you control. So you can use this to make a token of a thing that you're making. You could use this to copy Lucia Kane's effect, but if Lucia Kane isn't on the battlefield, you could just use it to copy the spell that you cast anyway. So it's basically replacing her to some degree. Copying instant or sorcery spells is also a pretty big deal, and the Twinning Staff can also copy instant or sorcery spells, but it costs like 7 mana, and there's not very many instant or sorcery spells in this deck. Now, if you wanted to run more like the Cultivates and stuff, you could still run those and run these and copy them, but you're looking at, like 2 cards out of your 100 that could potentially copy those spells, which is kind of so-so on it. Dronic Resignator, 2-drop artifact. You can copy target triggered ability, basically. Pretty simple. 2 mana, copy thing. All these are good because they can copy both her token generation and also copy like the 1/1 counter effects that are just everywhere in the deck. So figure out what your best 1/1 counter effect is in the deck, and you can copy it. Our second form of graveyard recursion is Paleoloth. So this is a beast creature. Kind of looks Tyranid-ish, hard to say. 6-drop, 5/5. Whenever another creature with power 5 or greater comes into play under your control, you may turn target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. The reason we're trying to return things from our graveyard to our hand is so that we can copy more X-cast spells, and then copy them to get more and more Tyranids. So even if you got this down on the ground and then you brought back one of those X-cost spells from your graveyard to your hand, well then you could potentially play it, copy it, get 2 creatures, and then copy it again with any of the other copy effects and get 3 creatures or 4 creatures. So it just kind of gives us more benefit that way. And also, if we have this effect, we have this down, and we play one of those X cost effects for like 5, then it copies with Lucia Kane, we get 2, then this triggers twice, and then also, Lithoform Engine and all that stuff can copy this trigger, or can copy Lucia Kane and put another token on the field to trigger this again. So you could potentially get 3, 4, 5 cards back to your hand just with this card. The problem is that we only really have 2 graveyard recursions in the deck, and the other one is like a spell, so the Finale of Devastation. So I need to find maybe potentially a different kind of recursion to use other than Finale Devastation, or find somewhere to slot in another one that you could potentially bring things from your graveyard to your hand, but I haven't found it yet. But in any case, I think that would be a pretty powerful effect, and you can still put 1/1 counters on it. Another one, I'm happy that they reprinted in Fallout because the original artwork was a ox and it was kind of annoying. But we got Fog Crawler, kind of looks like a Tyranid. So essentially, this is the Vigor Ox, but Fog Crawler is an elemental incarnation with Trample 6/6 for 6 mana. So it already can, essentially, it's a big threat for your opponents. For 6 mana, you get a 6/6 with Trample. And then if damage would be dealt to another creature you control, prevent that damage. Put a 1/1 counter on that creature for each 1 damage prevented this way. When Fog Crawler is put into a graveyard from anywhere, shuffle it into its owner's library. So essentially, this is the thing that could potentially keep us from decking ourselves if we draw a bunch of cards and then we just discard this into our graveyard and then get it back into our library. But it's going to be kind of hard to say because, like, somewhat hard to use, but this is going to be pretty good. So essentially, you can swing in with your Tyranids. Then, when combat damage and stuff happens, it prevents all the damage that happens to them. And then any of the damage that gets blocked, essentially, all those 1/1 counters are going to be going right onto the Tyranids and getting them that much bigger. And then with the other card that we talked about earlier, I believe the Passage of Right, you can already see that, like, essentially you could attack in, negate the damage, put more 1/1 counters on it, etc. But you could also potentially copy the Fog Crawler with Lithoform Engine and stuff like that. So if you have like a 12/12 Tyranny coming in, they block it with a 5/5. This would prevent that 5 damage, put 5 more 1/1 counters on that thing, and then you could potentially Lithoform Engine this or whatever else, or Primal Vigor it or whatever, and then it's going to get 5, 10, 15 1/1 counters on it pretty quickly. Next card that we have is the Ozolith. So this is a 1-drop artifact, legendary artifact. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto the target creature. So this thing just stores all of your 1/1 counters. There was already one card in the deck that does this as well, so you have 2 cards in the deck that could potentially store all your 1/1 counters or move them onto another creature if something happens to it. So this is going to keep your board really big, really quick. So as soon as the deck gets running and you start getting a bunch of 1/1 counters, people are going to be on a timer to deal with you because they're just going to get overrun. So unless they have enchantments or artifacts or something that can shut down your Tyranids, this is a problem. And because no creature is going to be running, like even Eldrazi probably aren't going to be able to deal with the amount of 1/1 counters and stuff we're having. Next card, the Great Hinge. This is 7 and 2 green, but we're probably just going to cast it for 2 green. Legendary Artifact. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. And then you can tap it, add 2 green, you gain 2 life. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on it and draw a card. So this is potentially a 2-drop artifact, probably most likely a 2-drop artifact, just because the greatest power among creatures you control is going to get pretty big pretty quick. Even with Lucia Kane, um, he starts off as a 1/1, but she gets those 1/1 counters, stacking them up on other creatures pretty quickly. But this thing right here, essentially, we already got Soul Ring that can give us +2 mana early. This thing can give us +2 mana early. Lucia King can give us +2 mana early. So we have 3 or 4 cards that are going to be able to give us quite a bit of mana early with this. There's also a Tyranid that enters with 2 1/1 counters, and when it attacks, you get to search out a basic land. It is a little bit slower, but technically, it's still 1/1 counter, 1/1 counters, and also ramp that just never ends. So we have quite a few mana sources that could potentially bump us up pretty quick early if we run into them and we have the right stuff. So Great Hinge, you know, life gain a little bit, which can help us. Extra mana, 1/1 counters, card draw on one. Pretty good card. Now we get into basically the 3 cards that are like the big hitters when it comes to our card draw packages. Essentially, we have all the Tyranids that have the X cost, which could potentially draw us multiple cards with a Cane. Then we still have things like the Hinge, but these are basically the big ones. So Kindred Discovery, 3 and 2 blue, as Kindred Discovery enters the battlefield, choose a creature type, which is Tyranid. Whenever a creature you control of the chosen type enters the battlefield or attacks, draw a card. So whenever we summon a Tyranid, we draw a card, and it just enters the battlefield, so the copies will also let us draw a card. And when they attack, we draw a card. So this could potentially be 2, 3, 4, 5 cards in a turn. And then when we attack, just draw us that much more cards too. So these are the draw engines of the deck that essentially, are going to let us run people over. If they don't stop the Tyranids in their tracks, if they don't board wipe them, if they don't, have some sort of enchantment or artifact that protects them from a swarm of Tyranids, we're just going to draw a ton of cards and find our stuff very quickly and just run people over as soon as the deck comes online. Same thing we did with the Sour and the Dark Lord. That deck takes a little bit to come online, and then it just, you go through like 12, 20 cards or whatever in a turn. Next one is Reconnaissance Mission. 2 and a blue enchantment. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. Cycling 2, discard this card, draw a card. So essentially, this one isn't as good, but when we do combat damage, we get to draw a card, and that's just whenever a creature we control does combat damage. Um, you may draw cards. You don't have to deck yourself with this one. Kindred Discovery can deck you for sure. So that's going to put you on a timer if you use that. But if you have Simic Ascendancy, um, if you draw into Simic Ascendancy before you deck yourself, you potentially could save yourself the trouble of dying. So that's probably pretty good. But Reconnaissance Mission is going to be pretty good. If you get this down early with some small creatures, you're just going to get a bunch of card draw off of this. You get this down late, it's going to give you a bunch of card draw. If you get Trample on your creatures, this is going to give you a bunch of card draw. So that's all pretty good. And then the other one is Coastal Piracy. 2 and a blue enchantment. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. So these attack ones aren't necessarily as good as the Kindred one, but it's may draw a card, so you don't necessarily have to deck yourself because you're going to be going through a bunch of cards. You got to realize when you get your mana going in this deck that all of your X-cost spells are going to be drawing you cards for the most part, and all your attacks are going to be drawing you cards, and when anything dies, you're going to be drawing you cards. So you're going to be going through a bunch of cards very, very quickly as soon as things get going. Also, would say I'd be tempted to add Helmet of the Host into this deck, but I'm not really sure because Helmet of the Host, you're talking about 9 mana to get like a copy of something, but if you copy Lucia Kane, it becomes 2 extra mana and also extra spell copies because her copy, you can tap 1 Lucia Kane, get the 2 mana, its stat goes on, tap the other so you can get 2 mana, this stat goes on, then you cast an X cost spell, it'll copy with both of them to make more and more Tyranids. So Helm of the Host potentially could be an ad in the deck as well, just because having like 6 Lucia Canes sound good, or 6 Swarm Lords, or 6 anything else. Okay. The mana and the precon is basically all still the same. We took out all of the sorcery type of things to essentially not have spells that we can't recur for the most part. But even with all this, we're still looking at about 50, you know, 49, 50 mana cards. Plus, we still have our commander, which is consistent, guaranteed mana. And a lot of our cards, like the Great Hinge, the Commander, Soul Ring, a couple of the Tyranids, stuff like that, or give us multiple endless sources of mana. So the 1/1 counter Tyranid, for instance, we'll see, but all the lands are just going to be the same. The other stuff you're going to have is the Soul Ring. Now, the Haru specs, a lot of people take out of the deck. We're leaving it in the deck. It is a 3 and a green, 2/2. And whenever another creature dies, put a 1/1 counter on it, which is alright. It's not terrible. That isn't really what we're looking for, but if our creatures are running somebody over, basically every time that our opponents block something, we're getting mana off of it. And then you can tap, remove X 1/1 counters from Hero Sphinx, add X mana of any one color. So that right there is going to be a bunch of mana because a lot of our deck is putting 1/1 counters on our creatures. Plus, Lucia Kane can put 1/1 counter on your creatures at least once a turn. So this can at least be 1 mana a turn, pumping up, as well as being a creature and stuff. The deck is kind of vulnerable to board wipes though. Then we got the Nexos, which is already in the precon. 2/2 for 2. Basic lands you control have tap, add 2, spend this mana only to cost only on costs that contain X. So this is potentially another Soul Ring type card for 2 mana, but it can only be used on X cost spells, which there's like 14 or something in the deck, not to mention the additional ones that we added. So I still have, probably another 2, probably have like 16 or more X cost spells, so potentially that's good. And then with Graveyard Recursion, we'd be able to get more value off of it. Then we got the Pure Strain Gene Stealer, the 3-drop Tyrannid 1/1. Enters with 2/1/1 counters on it. And then whenever it attacks, you can remove a 1/1 counter from it. If you do, search your library for basic land, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. The thing with this is that essentially when it comes in, it gets 2/1/1 counters. You could potentially copy that and give it more 1/1 counters. Because it's going to trigger, get 1/1 counters, Lithoform Engine, Stronic Resignator, um, Primal Vigor, Doubling Season. You're going to get 4 or 6 or 8 1/1 counters off of this for 3 mana. So even just with one proc, it's 3 mana for 3. It could potentially 3 mana for 5/5, 3 mana for 7/7. But then when it attacks, you could also copy those effects. So whenever it attacks, you can remove a 1/1 counter from it, insert your library for basic land, put it on the field. So if you attack with this, you could Strionic Resignator it, Lithoform Engine it. If you had, Helm of the Host in the deck, you could potentially use that. So if those cards are on the field, this becomes way better in the grand scheme of things. Okay. And then we got the Altalon Jekyll, human Tyrannid Scout. So you got 3-drop, 2/2, trample, haste. So potentially this could come in and get a bunch of 1/1 counters on it from the Ozolith or anything else and just one tap somebody because it has trample and haste. You can catch someone off guard. So this is potentially a game ending card, end game. Early game, though, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tapped, then shuffle. If you have Lithoform Engine or anything else, you can copy that effect and get multiple lands per turn, which gives you more and more ramp. I'm a big fan of land ramp in a lot of decks, even like monocolored decks. I played mono white for a long time and I preferred land ramps. So the next one, we got the Sporogeist. So that's the other one that's going to be kind of a big thing. So it gets the Ravenous effect, so you can draw the card Defender, but when it enters the battlefield, search your library for up to X basic land cards, put them on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So you could potentially just Ravenous this for like, 3 mana, becomes a 1/1, and then you copy it. With Lucia Kane, you copy it, boom, you get 2 land just from that early game. And then late game, I mean, you could draw a card off of it. If you have Lithoform Engine or anything off, you can copy it. If you have Primal Vigor or Doubling Season out, you could copy it again and get more and more lands. If you had Helm of the Host and you had that on there, you could copy it every turn, then copy it with Doubling Season and stuff, get more and more lands. All that kind of stuff is very good. We still have Overgrowth in here because this is a 3-drop enchant land. Whatever champ is tapped for mana, its controller adds 2 green. Basically 3-drop to give us 2 mana, so and it's not an artifact, so it kind of separates our mana a little bit. So if people try to hate us out with all that, another reason to do land-based mana in the deck instead of just artifacts and stuff. We're trying to get the creatures on the field that can empty the lands onto the battlefield so that we can stay consistent. If someone board wipes the mana rocks or the equipments or the artifacts or whatever else, we'll still be fine. Then we got Biophagus. Tap, add 1 mana of any color. If this mana is spent to cast a creature spell, the creature enters the battlefield with additional 1/1 counter on it. So essentially, this is a 2-drop, 1/3 mana dork thing. But if you have, lithoform engines or Strionics or the primal or doubling season, I mean, it's just going to give you an additional 1/1 counter on things that you cast. And so, all that stuff's pretty good. I think as long as this, so if you tap to add 1 mana of this and then you cast an X cost spell, then the X cost spell, say it was 4. I don't know if it having 5/1/1 counters come in, if it would change. No, it has to be X. Okay. Then you still have your Arcane Signet, basically the last mana rock that was already in the precon. And then there's all your basic lands that you have in the precon are still in there. So that's going to give you the gist of all that. Now, this deck has 4 protections for your creatures. So the first one was already in the deck, Inspiring Call. 3-drop instant, draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible till end of turn. So it's protection for all of your 1/1 counter creatures. It's a ton of card draw if you have a bunch of 1/1 counter creatures. And also, you could potentially copy this with drawing a blank here. Twinning Staff could potentially copy this, and Lithoform Engine could potentially copy this to double its value. So that's things to think about there. Then you have the Raviner, which it's not really protection, but it kind of was for me. It's still a Tyranid. It's an X cost spell, so you can copy it. So potentially, you could copy this 2, 3, 4 times plus however many copy things that you have. And it comes in, you can potentially draw cards off of it, has flash to use whenever, and then when it enters the battlefield, target creature attacks a target opponent this turn if able. So you can keep your opponent from killing you, potentially force them to kill their opponent for you, or open themselves up so that you can actually kill them next turn. Kind of a neat little trick Tyranid that you could use. Next card that we have that is kind of additional to the deck is Repulsive Mutation. So, blue-green X instant spell. Put X 1/1 counters on target creature control. So this can boost a big creature really quick. Then counter up to 1 target spell unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So this is your counter spell in the deck. It's the only counter spell that you really have in the deck, so use it wisely, but potentially this could be a game-ending card right here. If it happens to get in your hand, even if you have like a small thing on the board, you could dump like 10 mana into this, dump it on, or say like Lucia Kane, for instance, this could be like her big protection spell. Someone tries to stop you from using Lucia Kane because we don't have a ton of protection for her, then you drop Lucia Kane taps, you drop this for like 10 mana, she copies it, you counter a spell, you get like 20 counters on her, and then the next turn you just go in for like commander damage or something. But any big creature, this is your one saving grace for a big vital creature for the most part. And then you got the classic Tyrannid Guard. Still got Ravenous. You can sacrifice creatures you control, getting hexproof and indestructible till end of turn. So, Tyrannid Guard, solid card. So you're going to have two potential protections versus destruction board wipes. You're going to have two potential protections versus some sort of targeted ability or spell against one creature. And then you have that one creature that could potentially open up an opponent's board state or help them kill someone off for you as like a trick card. Board wipes, we still have the classics. So you have the um, Exocrine. This thing we pretty much thought about removing because it's kind of annoying for the most part. But since the deck now has a lot more 1/1 counter synergy, I think it might be safer to use this than it was in the precon. But also, if you copy this, it's basically like it nukes its own copies, which is kind of annoying. So like if you copied it for like 5, they would come in as 7/7s. The first one would come down, hit everyone for 5. Second one would come down, hit everyone and that for 5. The problem with this card essentially is that it can kill you very quickly if you have no health. But this can also be a game-ending card if you end up pushing people on their heels and then your deck stalls out and you draw into this and they only have like 12 health left. You could potentially just burn them down with that really quick, as well as get you a couple of Tyranids on the board. So, something useful. One of the additions that we put into the deck, though, aggressive biomancy. This is probably one of the better board wipes that we can have in the deck. So, blue-green sorcery, you can pay more into it for XX. Create X tokens that are copies of target creature you control, except they have, when this creature enters the battlefield, it fights up to one target creature you don't control. So, essentially, Lucia Kane, you dump like, let's say 10 mana into this. You make 5 copies of a creature that you have, then you destroy 5 copies of something that's else on the board. But say like you Helmed of the Host Lucia Kane, then you could aggressive biomancy one of the tokens from Helm of the Host, make like 5 of those, they come in, each of them fight everything, but then you could tap all of those to get more triggers, you know what I'm saying? Or you could potentially even, cast this, target Lucia Kane, the other Lucia Kane comes in, then they see each other, then you tap the other Lucia Kane, gain the mana, sacrifice her, and you get to keep her ability. So you could put like, I don't know, say you put 4 mana into here. So for 6 mana, you make 2 Lucia Kanes. They fight 2 other creatures, but you tap them really quick, and oh no, they wouldn't have haste. Any case, there's a lot of things that you can do with this. You can copy the Tyranids that give you lands. You can copy the Tyranids that give you 1/1 counters. You can copy the Tyranids that give you uh, go wide strategies. There's a lot of things you could potentially do with this. And then Helm of the Host just adds a little bit more if you were to use that on top of it. But this, I think, is a really good just like removal card, as well as like giving you some sort of board state. Ways you can just copy a target creature, so it doesn't really have to be anything crazy. Then you still got the Star Storm, essentially the Tyrannid's version of Blasphemous Act. X cost, so you can copy it with Lucia Kane. But you can also cycle it to draw a card, so that's good. Still got the Aetherize in there. Bounce attacking creatures to your hand could be used to save you, could also be used to save your own creatures. For instance, like if you attacked into a mono white deck like me, and then someone did like Settle the Wreckage and was going to exile all your creatures, and you could be like, Aetherize, bring all your creatures back to your hand. Or if you wanted to like uh, grow your board state more, you have extra creatures on the board, you attack in, then you Aetherize your own creatures back to your hand, then you resummon them for Lucia Kane to copy their effects again to get more value. I think that's also pretty good. So a little bit of versatility there. And then you still have, for the other removals, basically, is still a bunch more creature removals. So you still have the Zonothrope, which fights things when it comes in. You still have the Screen Killer, which fights or just does 5 damage to things when you cast spells with 5 or greater. which is going to happen once the deck gets rolling. Then you have pretty much your only artifact and enchantment removal from the Aberrant, which so that's basically one of your most vital creatures in the deck potentially. You're gonna have to dig through it, find it, and keep it alive or keep it safe. Um, and then you have the Mawlock. It fights up to one target creature opponent controls, but if it would die, exile it instead. And then you have Hull Breach, which is the only other artifact or spell thing you have. You could potentially copy it with Lithoform Engine, but essentially you only have two things that are going to be able to deal with artifact or enchantment. So if you're playing in a pod and someone has artifact or enchantments that could potentially slow you down, you're going to need to take them out immediately before things go down. Because if they get gridlocked, it gets gridlocked. But you still have some of those other cards from the first of the game as well, so you still got that Bread for the Hunt, which allows you to draw whenever you get combat damage, and then you still have the abundance, which anytime that you draw is going to let you, choose land or non-land. So you're going to be able to make sure that all your draws are things that you want. Most part. Ugh. Yep. Now, besides going in with big creatures and 1/1 counters, because essentially every single creature that you have in the deck, since they get 1/1 counters, and since those counters can be doubled, tripled, or added on to, every creature is technically creature removal. So you don't necessarily need spells that remove creatures like all those Tyranid spells there. So all of these cut cards that we potentially have, because we still have 3 that we want to stick in, potentially 4, but that would still give you 4 or 5 cards that you could replace and add in more artifact or enchantment removal, etc. So all of those are all pretty viable, I would say. Um, Consistent wise, it would be pretty good. But then your main other source besides like your 1/1 counter sources are basically like one way that you're going to be trying to end the game just with straight damage, but you also have 3 cards that are your other main cards. So the Tyranid Hydrant is basically going to be one of your big hitters. 6-drop 4/4. Whenever it or another Tyranid you control deals combat damage to a player, you create a Tyranid Gargoyle. So this is going to be one of the big ones that's going to allow you to swarm the board really quickly and try to end the game pretty quick. Then you have the Termagant Swarm. So when it dies, it makes a creature token equal to its power. So it basically just makes a number of smaller ones with equal to its power. And each of those could be coming in with extra 1/1 counters, etc. on it, and then all you have to do is find a way to bring this back and keep reusing it over and over. So you got potential board wipe protection on that from your deck. So that would go into your protection as well, because that's just a way, like if they wipe all your creatures, that dies, all of the Tyranids come back, boom. Then you get swarmed by those. But then you also have the Turbinicleweed. Trample, 2-drop with X. When it deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green Tyranid creature tokens. So essentially, when this thing gets big, it's going to start producing a bunch of Tyranids. So that is also a card that you're going to be trying to get out pretty quick. Then you still got your Hardened Stales, you still got your Hormaganet Horde, which is basically one of your main, I wouldn't say win cons, but like that's one of your main cards where if you don't have a graveyard recursion, this is going to be your last thing that's on the line. The good news is that since we have the fog crawler in the deck, anytime it goes to your graveyard, it goes into your library, so you could potentially always have this and fog crawler together, which would essentially make this grow very large very quickly. Pretty good. You got Brood Lord. puts 1/1 counters on everything. Death's Presence, which is the other form of the Ozolist in this deck. Clam of Bayus, each creature you control gets 1/1 for each 1/1 counter on it, so it's just doubling all your power. So that's pretty good. Gene Stealer Patriarch, we actually kept this in here. Every other deck that we've seen online has removed this from the deck because they said it wasn't good enough. But a blue and 4 generic Tyrannid. When it attacks, put an infection counter on target creature defending player controls. Whenever a creature with an infection counter on it dies, you create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's Tyrannid in addition to its other types. So you get a copy and steal some of the stuff your opponents have, and they become Tyrannids, which fuel your deck. This is potentially a go wide card that could do a lot of work as well. Because well, I don't know exactly how this works exactly, but when it attacks, put an infection counter on target creature. So you can lithoform and strionic it to copy it, put it on other creatures with that. But then if you have primal vigor and stuff, I think it just would double the counters. I'm not really sure. But essentially, I mean, that's just replacing itself. So, you put those on them, then someone like board wipes or something, this hits, boom, it makes copies, kind of protects you that way. Then we've got Trigon Prime. When it attacks, put a 1/1 counter on up to one other target creature, and it can't be blocked this turn. So this is just a way to get one big hitter through like Swarmlord. Then you got Winged Hive Tyrant. So 5-drop 4/4 flying haste. Other creatures you control with counters on it have flying and haste. So that's going to be a big one that kind of lets you in the game. So we got 2 trample and we got flying and haste. We got a thing that makes something unblockable. Um, and then we have some cards that just innately have trample, which is also good. We still have Bone Sabers in here because although a lot of people say this is bad because it's 6 mana, um, you know, equip creature attacks, you get 4 1/1 counters on it, but essentially if you have Strionic Resonator, a Lithoform Engine, Primal Vigor, Doubling Season, all of that on here, those 4/1 counters, even with one like Lithoform Engine, turns into 8 1/1 counters just in one attack. So if you have any doubling on top of that, you're looking at 8, you're looking at 16. So you could potentially get a massive creature just with one attack out of this. So you play a creature, equip it for 3, swing, copy, boom. It's like a 20/20. Put this on something else, swing, boom, boom, 20/20. Kind of the idea there. I like the Bone Sabers just because it's a Tyrannid weapon. Old One Eye is still in the deck, so trample 6/6 for 6. Other creatures you control have trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a 5/5 green Tyrannid creature token. And also, this card is one of the few that when you lose it into the graveyard at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you may discard 2 cards. If you do, return it from the graveyard to your hand. So this is a way that you could potentially keep making 5/5s, and you can also potentially keep giving things trample over and over again and have some sort of big hitter that can end the game. This guy is still going to be putting in work. You could have like that card that lets you sacrifice a creature and then draw cards equal to its power. So like One Eye would come out, boom, you sack it for 6. Technically, you could sack both him and his token and get like 11 cards. But if you just sack him for 6, boom, then you have to discard 3, but then you get rid of 2 to bring him back to your hand, and then you could play him again, and then you sack him. So you get 1/5/5, 1 card every time that you did that, but you're looking at 6 mana potentially every time that you do that. But if you don't necessarily care about having him on the field and you just want to make 5/5s, this means that you could potentially steal somehow, make something happen just by using this card repeatedly. as long as you can sack it or do something with it, get it killed. And then we still have Melanthrope in here, which this thing isn't super great, but it's kind of come in clutch in the precon in the past. So it's just a 3-drop 2/2 flying. But when it enters, you exile target player's graveyard, and it gets 1/1 counter for each of it. This has gotten massive for me in the past, but also it's one of the few things that give graveyard hate in this deck. So potentially, you'd add a couple of lands that give a little bit more graveyard hate to the deck, I would assume, would be the better choice to do. But yeah, for the most part, that is all of the deck. Although I haven't play tested it yet, ideally, since Lucia Kane is 2 less than Swarmlord, and I was playing the precon with Swarmlord in the past, I liked Swarmlord better because he would come down and you get 2/1/1, so you get like a 7/7, and you could swing in with them, and you get that card draw over and over. Whereas like Lucia Kane in the precon, I think she's probably good, but her problem was is that you slowly built up a board state, and once somebody wiped you, she wasn't strong enough to really do anything. And then when you didn't have X cost spells, nothing was going on. Whereas like Swarmlord, you could just recast them. Like they board wipe you, you get to draw a bunch of cards, you recast it, and you start swinging in again. But it still had some issues. But now Swarmlord is basically more like its lore, which I guess it's like a creature that kind of stalks in the background and then it pops up every now and then to fight. But in this deck, this is potentially a win con in and of itself because if it comes in and it gets haste and trample, or if it comes in and just gets trample, or if it comes in and symbiotic uh, ascendancy is there, because let's say that you cast like Lucius Kane twice, then this is going to come in and get 4/1/1 counters. And then if you have like Lithoform Engine or Primal Vigor or Doubling Season and stuff, you're already looking at like 8, 16 additional counters. And then, or Simic Ascendancy, you put mana into it, put 1/1 counters on it. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can do, but I think this is about the best I can do for the precon for the most part. Just try and make it a little bit more balanced, a little bit more interesting. I'm still thinking about this Rite of Passage because, in a way, 3 mana. If a creature you control is dealt damage, you get 1/1 counters on it. Could be good if people like try to firebolt stuff or anything like that. Or like if the only thing I can really think that would make this good is the board wipes that I have in the deck, because if I hit like a board wipe and then it smacked everything, I would get 1/1 counters on everything that I have. And then if I doubled that with Primal Vigor or Doubling Season, essentially you get like 2/1/1 counters and board wipe everybody or something along those lines. But the artwork is really the only reason I still have it in here, as far as I can tell. I think uh, Death Leaper Terror Weapon's probably gonna go. New Horizons probably gonna go. I think we're gonna try and keep the Bio Titan, the Exocrine, and the Tyrannid Prime. Cultivate's probably gonna go. I would like to keep Venom Thrope as well, though. So that's kind of a toss up there because we have the Biomancer Master, the Staff, and we have the Staff, Doubling Season, Hour of Devastation, or Finale of Devastation, and then the other one. So potentially 3 to 4 cards that we're already going to have to replace on top of this. And there's not a whole lot that I would like to change off the top of my head. The flying hexproof one would probably be the easiest thing to get rid of, but a flying creature with cool artwork and stuff just seems pretty good. Flying Hexproof, Death Touch, goes in. Tyranid Prime lets everyone get 1/1 counters. Toxicrene just shutting down enemies' lands. Biotitan just allowing you to, get rid. Like you have 5 small creatures with 1/1 counters. You dump those. You just put Biotitan on the field. Although the Biotitan doesn't have 1/1 counters, but I mean it's essentially just like this deck's Eldrazi. If someone else has an Eldrazi, you pop the Biotitan down. It's the only way I can really think of it. Helm of the Host. You're looking at 9 mana to make 1 copy of a card. But if you just make a copy of Lucia Kane, that for 9 mana, making a copy of Lucia Kane might be viable. Because say Helm of the Host, you pay 9 mana, or you pay 5 mana, boom, comes to the field. Then you pay 4 mana, put it on Lucia Kane. Then you go to combat, you make a copy of Lucia Kane, and then at the end of combat, you tap both Lucia Kanes, you get 4 mana, and you can copy a spell twice. That seems decent to me because you're essentially paying 5 mana to get 3 additional creatures and 1/1 counters. So I don't know how that's gonna work out, but I'm going to take out Death Leaper Terror Weapon and put in Helm of the Host, probably. Because essentially, oh, it would be 5 mana. So essentially, for 4 mana, I can put Death Leaper Terror Weapon on, or I could put Helm of the Host on the field. And then when I pay 5 mana and equip it to Lucia Kane, I would get 4 mana back. So essentially, the equip cost becomes 1 after the 5 investment. And then I get a bunch more benefit out of it. So I'm going to do the Helm of the Host. Ugh. Death Reaper Terror Weapon. I think the Death Sleeper Terror Weapon, I think could potentially be good as like a surprise attack card, like because if you play this, it has haste, but you could play it on your turn, boom, it comes in, it gets double strike. Lucia Kane puts like 2 1/1 counters on it. Um, you get like 2 or 3 1/1 counters on it. It gets double strike and you swing in. Or if you Helm of the Host, Death Reap Terror Weapon, every turn, creatures that entered the battlefield this turn get double strike. But it's really just going to be this one creature. Like, you could play this, equip Bone Sabers to it, then you get double strike, and then you trigger double Bone Sabers, maybe. But the artwork on this card really isn't super crazy to me, I don't think. I think it's potentially a good just finisher card, to be honest. It's just like you put it down, you get double strike. You could trigger double card draw, you could trigger double like when you do combat damage, you get 1/1 counters and stuff. I could see that being good, potentially. But Helm of the Host is just a threat in most decks. Like, even the Swarm Lord. If you, like, say that you cast Lucia Kane 2 or 3 times. So say you cast Lucia Kane 2 times. Swarmlord comes in with 4/1/1 counters. It is now a 9/9. Helm of the Hosted it. Combat. Boom. Another Swarmlord comes in, enters with 2/1/1 counters for each time you cast your commander. It expands on this game. So you just get, boom, 2 Swarmlords with a bunch more 1/1 counters. You get 2 9/9s. 2 9/9s for 9 mana. That's pretty decent. Or like the Bio Titan, a 12/12. So you pay 2 mana. You drop the you pay 5/1/1 counters, you pay 2 green. Bio Titan comes in, 9 mana Helm of the Host, copies it, second Bio Titan. Oh, any case. But all the card draws in this deck I think are kind of interesting because all the ones that when a creature you control deals damage, you may draw a card, and then you have Abundance that essentially says, hey, I want to find creatures or I want to find lands. You can be like, first card draw, land, second card draw, creature, 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 find all your stuff, dump all your creatures in the graveyard, grab your graveyard recursion creature, put it down, and then start recurring things back from your graveyard to your hand, casting them, copying them, abundance probably isn't necessary in the grand scheme of things, just because you're probably going to be drawing so many cards in general that you don't necessarily need it. But being able to go land or non-land and kind of sort your deck out is pretty interesting. So I'll put abundance on the chopping block potentially. We have quite a bit of card draw already. Being able to just go creature or non-creature, I think being able to find your creatures is good, but there's not necessarily anything that makes me think we're going to have card draw issues. Swarmlord gives us things when it dies. We're going to get a bunch of cards when our creatures do damage. We'll get a bunch of cards if we sack a creature. The problem is just getting things online. Actually, abundance might still be good. Because if you don't have any card draw engines on the field and you play abundance for 4, and then at the beginning of your turn you essentially get to say creature and then search out a creature as fast as you can. So it's your like a tutor effect. Oh. Yeah, this will be interesting now. I'll keep these separated. We'll try to play test it this week if we can, because I haven't played the Tyranid deck in a while. So we'll try to play test it and see what happens. But the rest of this pretty interesting. I think the Gene Stealer Patriarch is especially interesting. It attacks, put an infection counter on defending creature. Defending player controls, yeah. That's pretty interesting. And with Lithoform, we could potentially copy this when we cast it. Get 2. Or you Helm of the Host it. Do you Helm of the Host the Gene Stealer, then you're just going to get a bunch more Gene Stealers constantly replicating. And then doubling season or anything else. Like, with doubling season and Primal Vigor alone, um, you're already going to be able to copy Helm of the Host at least once. But Lithoform and Strionic can do it too, I believe. So you could Helm of the Host anything, then I would have 4 cards that could potentially copy the Helm of the Host effect on any of these creatures, which is pretty crazy. Swarmlord, I don't know exactly how he's going to work out, but he's a big beater. He's also card draw if we get board wiped. Potentially a lot of card draw. So all that's pretty good. I would say that the biggest weakness in this deck is going to be if Lucia King gets nuked, or if you just don't get your card or your draw off at the very beginning. But the cards that are still on the chopping block here are Cultivate, New Horizons, Venom Throat, Rite of Passage, Biotitan, Exocrine, and Tyrannid Prime. Cultivate New Horizons are going to be swapped out for the Staff and Doubling Season, most likely. Um, Rite of Passage might be swapped out with Finale of Devastation, or something might be swapped out with Finale of Devastation. We haven't really decided. Other cards that we had kind of thought about putting in the deck, but we didn't decide to put them in the deck. We had Return of the Wild Speaker, which essentially is a 5 cost enchant or innocent, which you can draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, or non-human creatures you control get 3/3 until end of turn, which seemed pretty decent, but it wasn't really. It's a lot of mana just to be used once in a game. And then Primal Empathy was at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card if you control a creature with the greatest power among creatures on the battlefield. Otherwise, put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control. Primal Empathy, I would still say, is potentially an ad, but it's slow card draw. Every other card draw that we have besides our creatures are drawing us multiple cards. This one, not super crazy, but it does give you a 1/1 counter, but it's only one 1/1 counter. So it's not super crazy, I would say. Distant Melody lets you draw a card for each card of a permanent type you control. Foster, whenever a creature controlled dies, you may pay 1. If you do, reveal cards to the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put the card in your hand and the rest in your graveyard. Could be risky to do that because we could potentially lose our artifacts, so we don't necessarily want to dump a bunch of stuff in our graveyard. Guardian Project, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. That's potentially good, but it's only one card when you pay it. Um, but Guardian Project is potentially better than Primal Empathy. Overwhelming Stampede was basically something that we're not going to use. But Triumph of the Ferocity, beginning upkeep, draw a card if you control a creature with the greatest power, tied for the greatest power. Curse of Predation, whenever a creature attacks enchanted player, put a 1/1 counter on it. That was potentially something that'd be good, but I don't know if the enemy players would do it or not. And but it would give, you know, me a target to just swing into and grow really big. But the Guardian Project's probably the most interesting because whenever you play a creature, you're going to get to draw one card. But it doesn't seem that impactful. Family's Favor, though, is kind of interesting. When you attack, put a shield counter on a target attacking creature. Till end of turn, it gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, remove a shield counter from it. If you do, draw a card. The interesting thing is that with this, you can put your shield counter on it, but if it doesn't take damage, that shield counter still stays on it. So whenever it takes damage or gets destroyed, the shield counter will get removed. So it's potentially card draw, but also protection for a creature if you can swing in without it getting blocked. So if you manage to destroy all the creatures on someone's board and you had this down, then every turn you could just put a shield counter on an individual creature. And then whenever someone puts another one down, you can just shield a different creature, which is kind of interesting, but probably too much work.